Disembodiment and chronic dissociation are bleeding the colors from your life, and you don't need to have suffered intense childhood trauma or have full-blown dissociative identity disorder to understand that feeling of collective bodily wounding and escaping from the place we don't feel safe inside. We exist somewhere behind our eyes and sometimes above or behind ourselves. And this is a common challenge for almost everybody in our modern society, because it breaks my heart to say this, but all of my years of research and working with people one-to-one and healing my own dissociative challenges leads me to one conclusion, and that's that we're collectively dissociated, and many of the depressions, anxieties, addictions, and attention deficit disorders which are on the rise, many of the mental health challenges that we talk about frequently, might just be symptoms of that underlying dissociative challenge. In this video, I'm going to be sharing the best that I've found in terms of research and in terms of philosophies and practices to try and help you move wherever you may be on that spectrum of dissociation, from survival and disconnect to thriving and being more of an authentic self rather than a false self that's trapped in a defensive mechanism. So where should we begin? Well, I've got this question from one of my subscribers who has commented wonderfully on many videos, and that's what this series is all about, creating this connection between us and answering questions that need to be answered. So this question: do you think that the amount of structural dissociation matters for approaching parts work? And then an expansion about some challenges with dissociative identity and finding a therapist who's comfortable with the parts work approach. So thank you for the question. Initially, I was going to do this video focused on the parts work element, and then I realized that although this is actually the right direction, it's not the first step, and it's not even the first step at the very beginning. It's actually something which pays dividends once the main thing has been done when it comes to healing dissociation, which I'll get into as the topic of this video. Parts work, in a nutshell, though, is the internal family systems therapy style approach, or working with things like the inner critic, or parts like the inner critic, those hypercritical, dissociated, fragmented voices inside of us, and getting towards something like an internal citadel of the heart, which is a very complex way of saying having a robust sense of self, where the many parts and the psychic multiplicity that exists inside of ourself doesn't become something like the full-blown dissociative identity disorder, where we have different alters or different subpersonalities which are vying for control and can sometimes take over unconsciously. Most people will never get to that territory, but it's my true conviction that the multiplicity of the psyche, as confirmed by research into this space, is very much the normal human baseline. It's normal for us to have fragmentation. It's normal for us to have psychic splitting, to project things out into the world, which is something that I speak about on this channel incredibly often. The whole shadow work space and the Jungian transpersonal psychological space, all of it comes back to the same core conclusion that it's not a case of trying to prevent fragmentation or splitting. Early childhood development shows that the good mother, bad mother split as we're developing age 1, age 2 is very much the process that we all go through. There's simply too much information in the world, and we break up the world into chunks and pieces and little shorthand stories to try and make sense of things. And what happens in dissociation is that these stories and all these voices tend to take on a life of their own because we're not grounded in the reality which is in front of us. Of course, if we turn to a book like Donald Kalshed and his marvelous exploration of this topic, Trauma in the Soul, I hope you can see that there are different perspectives that we can take about what's happening in a dissociative moment. I recommend you read this book for yourself. For the sake of this video, we can summarize it in one word. It's a defense. Dissociation is a defense response to an unsafe environment or an unsafe internal feeling or perception of the environment. This is usually childhood trauma, but it can be an abusive relationship. But if we bring it back all the way into the everyday sense of dissociation, and this is the very tragic staring at the phone, not realizing that you're breathing through your mouth and you've slumped into a golem-like posture which is destroying your vitality, that doesn't reflect necessarily unsafety in the environment, but perhaps an unwillingness to want to be here in the first place. This is the tragic situation I think we're trapped in as a culture, and the reason that we can be sold hypersaturated images and pornographic fantasies or materialistic fantasies of what we could be if only we did X, Y, or Z is because we're so disconnected from our bodily reality that we can't discern truth from falsehood. Ultimately, what's happening in the dissociative defense is not that we've created a new identity. It's not that we've got a character trait which needs to lock us into a label for the rest of our life. It's that we're trying to keep ourselves safe from something which we perceive as being threatening or otherwise unpalatable. At its most extreme, we've got abuse, we've got trauma, we've got war, we've got conflict. At the lower grade, that low-grade buzz of sickness and distortion that we suffer from collectively, we have a lack of hope, a lack of engagement, and a lack of genuine willingness to be in an environment that we don't want to find ourselves really engaged in at all. Dissociation is a defense, and when we have that perspective that dissociation is a defensive response, we suddenly open up the possibility of moving beyond that defensive response, or in simple terms, going from a survival trance or a survival personality into something which is authentic and the very fated idea of the true self. So how do we do that? That's the point of this video. How do we move towards the true self? Well, I held up Internal Family Systems, and this is a wonderful book about the next step with internal family systems therapy, the somatic element, the physical element. At the very beginning of many dissociative healing processes, the therapist or the counselor will guide the client or the patient, whichever model you want to go for, towards sensitizing themselves into the here and now moment. And that's something which is pretty often spoken about. I suppose it's an obvious statement to make that you ground yourself in the body. It's also an anxiety management response. But I'm not interested in talking about that, even though it's very useful for this video. I'm going to take it as a given that you're already familiar with the idea of breath work, grounding, and resensitizing towards the environment, and that being something which is useful, because the direction I want to take this video in is actually getting towards self-actualization and self-identification as the body ego. I'm not going to go too much into the psychology of the body ego, but the fundamental idea that I want to try and plant into your awareness, and hopefully we can water this together, is that if there is a multiplicity in our mind, if there are many subpersonalities which are vying for attention, and sometimes it becomes way too much in the environment and we leave into a fantasy space where we feel unreal, we feel like a puppet master who's dangling the strings above our own actions and everything's happening at a strange distance. It's either way too fuzzy or way too sharp. The number one thing that we can do is to identify as the most concrete, most reliable, and most genuinely, in my personal bias, the most genuinely inspiring possibility, which is to reclaim our flesh. I suffered massively as a child because I was an overweight, video game playing, non-sporty kind of guy. It was only when I was 16, on my 16th birthday, that I took a photo of my shirtless body, realized that I was sick in the mind and sick in the body, and that physical training could bring me something like hope. Of course, when you're 16, you're aiming towards things like status and girls and image, but over a decade later, having lived the physical life and having found a way to express my essence, the tangible essence of what it means to be a human, which is your physical form, it's the number one conclusion that I come to in terms of how to heal dissociation on a collective level. Got some research suggestions for you and actually a place that we can take this in the concrete. I recommend Alexander Lowen. Hopefully you can see these books. Alexander Lowen is the founder of bioenergetic therapy. I've covered him many times on this channel. I recommend these books based on the topic that we speak to, but for the sake of this video, we're going to look at these two ideas: depression in the body and pleasure. Pleasure is where we're going to start. Something which I find incredibly useful for people who are healing from dissociation, which of course creates the foundation for parts work in the future, is to have a pleasurable experience of their own embodiment. This doesn't mean going all the way towards an overly sexualized or maybe naive understanding of what it means to be pleasurable in the flesh. It means to enjoy being a human, not to spiritually bypass into the land of the fairies or to go all the way into the self-destructive substance abuse territory, which is a mock. It's a fake ersatz version of sensuality, because of course you're actually poisoning yourself when you drink. It's to get into real, pleasurable sensations, which are naturally the birthright of any healthy human. This is to get into the bioenergetic space where it becomes pleasurable to walk. It becomes pleasurable to be in nature and to be genuinely stopped in your tracks when the sunlight comes through the leaves at a certain moment and you see how the shadows fall on the path and you smile automatically. Your senses, your perception, your feeling of being part of that natural scene, that becomes vitalizing, and that becomes something which is so worth sticking around for. But how do we get to that point? We do it primarily through fitness and sport. It seems like a bit of a strange thing to suggest, but I've seen it work with myself incredibly well, and I've seen it work with clients incredibly well, and I see it as something which of course has its own challenges along the road. There's body dysmorphic territory, there's potential body image issues that come up if someone's going from overweight, underweight to healthy, whatever that might mean. I have to avoid all of that for the sake of this conversation, to keep it impassioned and keep it a thorough line which hopefully lands in your awareness. To reaccess the pleasure of the body and to take away that feeling of lacking vitality or complete dissociation from the body needs to become something which is yours and which is I. It's not just my body. It's not just me as flesh. It's literally I. And this becomes something which is really challenging, especially in the spiritual space, because a certain healing moment is a healthy detachment from the flesh where we identify as the spirit. But for people who've suffered from dissociative tendencies in their childhood, leading all the way to their adulthood, they've already got that in place in most cases. They already understand what it feels like to exist as the spirit or something more soulful, because that's what they did to keep themselves safe and protect their innocence or their essence at a moment where they were being transgressed against. This happens at the low-grade level in everyday society where we're on our phones way too much and we're not in our feet even. I mean, how often do they go barefoot outside and actually realize that their feet have many intricate muscles which can grip onto the earth and interact with the environment, and it's not just foam underneath your foot to keep you disconnected literally from your roots. Bit of a barefoot tangent there. What I'm trying to say here is that you need to identify as the body and let that body be a pleasurable place that can express genuinely and in a wide variety of ways your actual essence. Sure, you will maintain the subpersonalities. Dissociation is wonderfully complemented by things like parts work, which talk through active imagination means or voice dialogue means towards the parts directly. But the body ego is always the thing that you can ground yourself back into. This is me. I am this body. And if you truly love yourself, which is self-compassion and self-respect, wedded together, the feminine and the masculine principle, you will live your life in a way where your body becomes a temple, which not only becomes something which you worship at, but a sense of active worshipping through the expression that you bring forward and the pleasure of being a vital, red-blooded, animated human. The energy literally descends, and that's why I talk about grounding so much. If dissociation is something like living behind the eyes, or sometimes people feel like they're going off in one way or another, in very extreme cases they can see themselves from above, almost in third person. If you want to bring that energy down, you need to have a place that you want to return to. And sure, when it comes to trauma work, it gets very complex, and I've got videos on this channel which talk about that in detail. I'm not going to go into the trauma work in particular. The exciting idea which I want to inspire is to treat your body with so much fucking compassion and respect that it becomes a place that you love living inside. Because if you love living inside your flesh, and if you identify as your body, in addition to identifying as your spirit, and you do both, dissociation becomes something which need not be repeated. It's a defense which drops, because you don't need to defend against anything which would pull you away from that sense of autonomy, because you trust yourself, and you love yourself, and you're genuinely willing to root yourself into the earth, and from that place of autonomy, from that genuine groundedness, you can serve your gifts, hopefully, to the community of your choice. That's the key. Parts work will come later. Going into the psychic multiplicity, that's something which I truly think is worthwhile. But if you want the greatest disproportionate gains in terms of healing dissociation, if you want to temporarily move away from the many different parts and the many different stories which are playing out, and especially unplugging from this glowing screen, which, I mean, tragically, I hate this. I'm gonna go into this. How fucking disgusting is it that I didn't go through this personally, because thank goodness smartphones weren't around when I was a baby. I had television instead, which is still, got its problems, but that we're conditioning our children for the last 10 years or so, before they can even walk or talk, to navigate one of these and get their parenting through a glowing series of two-dimensional images and literally dissociate from birth. No wonder we've got mental health challenges in teenagers right now. No wonder people in their early 20s who even came into this kind of, in their mid-childhood, late childhood, no wonder there's so much anxiety, no wonder there's so much paranoia, no wonder there's so much depression and apathy. We never got taught how to be in the body because we weren't encouraged to stay there. The needs weren't met, and maybe getting a bit too passionate on the tangent, but I really do worry about the direction we're heading in if this is how we parent, and this is how we soothe ourselves when we're down. And substances may be one thing, drink may be something which is obvious to rail against, and it's not even a new idea to talk about screen addiction and internet addiction. But we're dissociating on a daily basis when we go into these places without awareness. It doesn't mean that we can't use a phone and we can't enjoy television, but if we don't have a grounded practice, if we don't have a sport or a gym routine or something which is a yoga routine even, dance, whatever, in the body, 3, 4, 5 times a week, and the place which becomes pleasurable to live inside. Not overly eroticized, not escaping from responsibility. You can still be a man or a woman in the world who's hardworking and genuinely mission-driven, but you'll be better in your work. You'll be more of a conscious partner in your relationships, and you'll be a more inspiring person for yourself to live inside if you create that temple which deserves to be worshipped by yourself without grandiosity, of course. Every word can have its expansions. I think I've made the point. Dissociation is awful. I don't want to be dissociated myself. The number one thing that I invite everyone to get into is this. It's this wonderful opportunity. We only get one of them. Treat it as best as you possibly can, because you will regret if you don't. I'm going to leave the video there. Next episode in the series, probably going to go back to parts work or something heady, but that's the way of inner work. I'll see you over there.